Good evening, friends. Welcome to the India Power Talk. As you know, India Power Talk is an initiative wherein we invite international thought leaders and domain experts to create an easily accessible digital reservoir of their insights, experiences, and strategies on the economy. This is meant to benefit not just Indian entrepreneurs and policymakers, but also international businesses, investors, and strategic partners who have invested in or intend to invest in India. We would be inviting entrepreneurs, economists, professors, investment bankers, inventors, scientists, lawyers, chartered accountants, and other senior professionals with experience in diverse sectors who could contribute on the subject. Today, I would be discussing an extremely interesting topic, global think tanks. A think tank or a policy institute is a research institute that performs research and advocacy concerning topics such as social policy, political strategy, economics, military, technology, and culture, and so on and so forth. Typically, the think tanks publish articles, studies, or even draft legislations on particular matters of policy or society as they may have been mandated. Considering the importance of the policy making, even large private organizations these days have started setting up think tanks for their own existence and profit. Today, globally, there are around 8,100 think tanks, and India having 510 being the second highest number of think tanks globally. Think tanks face many challenges, including funding, technology, and measuring their usefulness and success. Private businesses can quantify their impact using metrics such as sales or shareholders' returns, whilst that is a bit difficult for NGOs. Additionally, the new competitors in the form of law firms, advocacy groups, PR firms, and non-traditional media sources in transforming policy, research, and advocacy are the new challenges. And to talk on this rather unusual topic about global think tanks, I have today with me very senior and distinguished Mr. Prabhu Guptara, who was born and educated in India, currently based in UK, and worked primarily from Switzerland, helping boards of companies and organizations with strategic, organizational, human resources, and market-related issues. For over 15 years, he was responsible at one of the largest bank in the world for think tanks, briefing, and for holding the Distinguished Speaker Series in English language. Through these activities, he had the unique job of working with innovative, cutting edge, and otherwise outstanding people throughout the world to identify new ideas that might bring value to the company. Mr. Guptara, may I welcome to the India Power Talk, and may I initially request you to kindly briefly let us know about your interesting and equally challenging work and experience with the largest bank in the world.
So I should, first of all, thank you, Nitinji, for the kind invitation to be your guest today. Very happy to be here. First of all, I should make it clear that joining this big bank, biggest bank in the world, was not my idea. It was their idea. They invited me to join them because they knew of me. They had had some experience with me. And so they never advertised the post. They never asked anybody else inside the bank or outside. They just invited me to join and to start. First of all, my responsibilities were in the area of helping the bank to internationalize. Now, in a way, they were already a very international bank. They had been an international bank for over 100 years, but they were international in their operations. They were not international in their structure or in their culture.
I see.
And so I was asked to come in and help them to internationalize their culture. That was the first thing. And then in 3 or 4 years, that basic job was done. I mean, you never stop internationalizing your culture. Of course, you can always be more international, but the basic foundations had been laid, the basic processes had been set up, the basic cultural changes had been made, and therefore the engine was running. And therefore the question was, okay, so I've finished this job. What shall I do next? You know, shall I leave? Shall I go and do something different or what? And then they asked me to be responsible really for think tanks that I had started developing earlier, before the first job was finished. I had just started running them because I realized there were gaps in the areas that the bank was covering. You know, every large institution has its own divisions, subdivisions, units, and so on. and every one of them has their own responsibility. So there were units of the bank concerned with business development. There were units of the bank concerned with strategy. There were units of the bank looking, of course, after different businesses. All that was there. But some areas, even big areas, were missing. And so these big areas that were missing, I spotted and I said, look, we should be doing something about these areas. And that's how the think tanks originally started. They started as little meetings to think about this particular problem or challenge or opportunity. And then they developed into proper full-blown think tanks. So what happened was, once the thing had come into being in its proper form, in its full form, we had a budget, and the budget could be used for think tanks if we wanted. That means to say we initiated the topic for the think tanks.
I see.
And we were looking really for big areas worth, as a rule of thumb, at least $1 billion, because anything smaller than that is not worth thinking about for a big bank like that. Of course, the idea may come to nothing, or on investigation, the idea may turn out to be smaller than we thought, in which case, of course, we would not go ahead with it. But if the idea did prove to be substantial and did prove to be worth looking at, then of course we would look at that. So the ideas could come from us, or the ideas could come from other colleagues in the bank. They could be board members, they could be division heads, they could be unit heads, and together then we would see how the idea could be shaped, think tank around it. So what was the purpose of these think tanks? It was to not come up with books and reports and fat things that would sit on a shelf. In fact, when we started this, the CEO of the bank said to me, Prabhu, you are free to write as big books as you want and as substantial reports as you want, but please be clear that I will only read the first page. So far as I'm concerned, your report is only the first page. After that, you can write whatever you want, other people can read, I'm not interested in it. And of course, there was no point in writing these big things if nobody important, significant in the bank was going to do anything with them. So the reports of these think tanks always consisted of one page of A4, in which the first sentence or paragraph or clause, whatever you want to call it, first item, consisted only of what is the problem or the challenge or the opportunity. Next, is the bank doing anything about it? Has the bank done anything about it? If so, these are the things we have done or not done. Next, possible courses of action. We could ignore this, we could go into it full steam, we could start with a little toe in the water, whatever. Options. Recommended.
Okay.
Last line, recommended. This is what we recommend. Of course, then it went to the board. The board could look at it and say, what nonsense, this is useless stuff. They could look at it and say, interesting, but not interesting. Meaning, yeah, there is something here, but we are busy with other things. They could say, yeah, this is very interesting. Please go ahead and implement what you're talking about. Then, of course, the budget would need to be negotiated and all that.
Correct.
Or they could say, yeah, this is very, very interesting. We should do something about it. But Prabhu, if you don't mind, we have somebody better qualified than you to really implement this. You please let him do it. Or they would say, you please support him in doing it. Or I would be chairing the task force and other people would be working with me to explore it or to implement it, as the case might be. So the idea was, from these think tanks, which differed every year, how many we organized and what topics they were on, the idea was that at least one or two practical issues should come out which could be implemented. And on average, one idea in every 2 years was implemented. So you were talking earlier, Nitin, how do you measure the success of any think tank? For us, the success criteria was very clear. It is not that you found a good idea to work on. Yes, it was important to find good ideas to work on. It was not that you wrote something, but it was whether you and, of course, the board agreed that this was something worth implementing. And if there was one idea every 2 years or so, that was considered good enough, because basically they were paying for my salary, they were paying for a little bit of infrastructure. This was not a permanent think tank. We would pull in, depending on the topic, we would pull in the top professors, the top thinkers, the top consultants.
I was about to ask you as to how did you organize this? I mean, what was your internal team structure, or were you getting the external help?
Yeah, so the external help and internal help was organized according to the topic, because it's clear that if your topic is the legal environment for hedge funds, you need guys from hedge funds.
Correct.
I'm not the expert in hedge funds, yes, and the chief executive is not the expert in hedge funds. There is a unit dealing with hedge funds, so they had to be, of course, involved, and they had to delegate somebody to be involved with us in it. Then, of course, you're talking of the legal environment. So, of course, the bank has a legal department. Somebody from the legal department has to be involved. Then the fact that somebody from the legal department is involved is not good enough, because that poor person is not the expert in hedge funds.
Great.
Right? In fact, the whole of the unit may not have real expertise on what is happening in trends in hedge funds. They will know what the current status quo is, of course, because their job to know that. But what the trends are, what is the legislation that is coming in America, in Europe, in China, in India, this is not their expertise. Their expertise is, this is the law, this is what we're implementing. Right? So we had to bring in experts from outside who could tell us what the political thinking was. What are the chances for legislation X going through or not going through?
So would it
if
be
the
correct?
Legislation X goes through, what is the time frame in which we have to prepare what in order to be ready to implement in time? So this is just one illustration in relation to one topic. For every topic, it was different.
Would it be correct to say that you were closely working or associated with the business development of the bank?
Well, business development was one aspect that could have come in depending on the topic. So if you looked at the entry strategy for India, then of course the business development team had to be involved. If you're looking at how should we reorganize our operations in China, of course, then the Chinese department, the department looking after China had to be involved. If we're looking at lasers and how they are being transformed, and is there a business opportunity for us here, there is nobody in the bank looking after lasers, right? It's not our business. So we had to construct a team so that somebody in the bank was interested, and then we constructed the team mainly from outside. On the other hand, with real estate, when we looked at the globalization of real estate, the bank has real estate in important centers in the most expensive parts of the most expensive cities in the world. And each of them is within the legal context of that country, right? But there is one man or a small team sitting in Zurich, which is somehow coordinating and trying to keep on top of everything in all the real estate areas. So when you look at the globalization of real estate, you're looking at what is happening in the trends globally in real estate. How are they going to impact the bank? And what should the bank be doing in terms of responding to these global trends? And the idea, for example, was we could sell some of these properties and take them back from the seller. Part of the condition of the sale is we will take them back from the seller on rent. That way you release the capital involved. That party will redevelop the site according to what they want, and we will rent the area we are interested in. Gives us greater flexibility, reduces the cost of capital for us. But different locations had different solutions. And of course, you had to develop the kind of matrix on the basis of which these decisions had to be taken. So, and of course, then there is the additional question of, if globalization of real estate is taking place, which are the largest companies? Do we, as the world's largest bank, have the right relationships with these companies as they're expanding and globalizing? Because obviously they will have financial needs.
Correct.
Right? So there was the portfolio side, real estate portfolio side, and there is the banking side. So in each of these kinds of issues, whether it was a challenge we should be careful about, whether it was an opportunity, different expertise was involved. And the job was really to bring the different expertises together so that we could really think about this subject in the round, in the whole, so that we could come up with the best solutions for the bank.
Great.
That's basically what we were doing.
No, really thanks for a very elaborate and a very articulated response on internal think tank of the bank that you handled. Let me take you now to the global scenario. Could you dwell upon the current global think tanks and their work, and maybe also you could you could speak on what are the different categories of think tanks we are looking at currently?
Well, there is no official categorization of think tanks, but you could think of think tanks as being divided between private sector and public sector, if you wished. You could think of geographical categorizations, if you wish. You could think of subject-specific categorizations if you wish. There are think tanks that focus just on politics, mainly on politics. There are think tanks that focus on economics. There are think tanks that focus on law. There are think tanks that focus on technology. There are think tanks that focus on social implications or ethical implications of things, public policy. So different kinds of think tanks are there, and some think tanks try to cover many areas. The largest of them obviously cover the largest number of topics, geographically or whatever. But it's not easy to come up with a categorization of think tanks. All I would say is that both at a global level and certainly within the United States and India, the two markets that I know quite well in the think tank space, and I would say in the UK, which is the third space that I know quite well, in these three areas, the variety of think tanks is more than adequate. That means we've got very large think tanks, we've got very small think tanks, and we've got think tanks covering almost every area you can think of, which a think tank should cover, at least in these three regions: America, United States, UK, and Switzerland, three markets I know. India, obviously, we have the second largest number of think tanks in the world, as you were saying, and we have certainly a very wide spread of topics that is being covered by them. Some may be more effective, some may be less effective, not in terms of their thinking. The thinking quality is very high, but in terms of their ability to transfer those ideas into implementation.
During the discussion, 2 weeks back, you did mention to me that the number of think tanks increased in the 80s, and then it's sort of peaked, and then it gradually came down. Could you just elaborate upon that?
Well, there are no figures to show that the number of think tanks has come down, but the intuition is that the number of think tanks has come down. Why is the intuition like that? Because, as you were saying, there's more and more competition for the space from non-think tanks, number one. Number two, the amount of money that is available for this kind of activity has been going down, at least in the last 2 or 3 years. And then, of course, there is the issue of certain think tanks we know have been closed down. And if you look even beyond the think tanks, if you look to the university space, you see that universities are closing down whole departments.
I see.
University of London, for example, has recently closed down its entire department that looks at Latin America.
I see.
So these are huge steps that are being taken by major institutions to cut down expenses. And so the instinctive feeling is that the number of think tanks has started coming down and probably will continue to come down. So as has happened in most other sectors, we will find the largest think tanks continuing to prosper. We will find the smallest think tanks somehow managing to do okay and maybe producing very good work. But the middle-sized think tank will be stripped out of the economy, as has happened to banks, as has happened to manufacturing companies, as has happened to the rich and the poor divide. You can see that there's no middle class left. You have the very rich, the super rich, the Adanis and so on at the top, and then you have the very poor. The middle class is being attacked basically by the system that we have created globally. It doesn't matter whether you're talking private families or you're talking public institutions, you're talking private companies, the same phenomenon is evident. Big survive, do well; small survive, okay; middle class gone.
Do you see at a very macro level, do these think tanks converge on issues or the conclusions or their processes or practices?
No. Think tanks are on the left and on the right. There are think tanks that pursue a very leftist vision. There are think tanks that pursue a very rightist vision. So think tanks vary in their orientation. You will find some think tanks are very free market. Some think tanks are very pro-green and therefore obviously limiting the extent of the free market. Some think tanks are very pro-social, meaning they want to look after the poor, encourage education and so on and so forth. Others say, no, everything should be privatized. Jails should be privatized, army should be privatized, everything should be privatized. So there's contradictory thinking going on depending on your values. If you prioritize money and efficiency, you get one set of recommendations from a think tank. But if you prioritize, let's say, care for the environment, if you prioritize care for people, If you prioritize care for society, you get a different set of recommendations. So it really comes from the values that the think tanks represent.
In your experience, how much really these think tanks make a visible difference?
So think tanks, go back a long way. And if you start at the very beginning, if you read up the literature on it, you will find that the first think tank, which is mentioned in the literature, comes from the 8th or 9th century AD in China. But actually, think tanks go back probably 2,000 years earlier to Israel, where in the 11th century BC, there was before Christ, 11 centuries before Christ, there was a school of the prophets. Now, what is a school of the prophets? The job of a prophet is to foresee the future, right?
Correct.
The job of a prophet is to foretell what is going to happen, right? Of course, he gets it from God and so on, is a different matter. But what is his job? It's to foretell the future. So in the 11th century BC, we already had a school of the prophets. So the interesting contrast between the 9th century AD Chinese think tank and the 11th century BC Israeli think tank is the following. The Chinese think tank was patronized by the emperor. So it was an official think tank.
I see.
It had access to power, and what they said could be implemented by the emperor if he, of course, wished. In the case of the Israeli think tank, it was not paid by the king, it was paid by the people. Why was it paid by the people? Because a prophet sometimes foresaw disaster for their country.
Correct.
Which the king was not happy to hear. Sometimes they were willing to tell the king, look, you're doing the wrong things ethically, which of course the king didn't like to hear. So in Israel, the kings were always, not always, I shouldn't say always, were very often against the prophets, and the prophets were very often against the kings. In other words, the think tank was against government policy. And the government policy was against the think tanks. So you see, two models were set up there in the 9th century AD and the 11th century BC, and that is still the case today.
Correct.
Some think tanks are patronized by the powerful, the rich, etc. Other think tanks are patronized by the people. Somehow they are surviving on small donations from millions of people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. And one group will give advice according to how their nose picks up which way the emperor wants to go. They will give, according to that, some politically appropriate advice. The other guys are not bothered about what is politically possible or not possible, appropriate or not appropriate. They will just say, look, this is the right thing, you should do it. That is the wrong thing, you should not do it. These two kinds of think tanks still exist.
Great. That's a fantastic insight. And a really good, good comparison and the history. Prabhuji, given the current pandemic and the economic crisis that we are seeing, of course, the United Nations has its own SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are being pursued by various institutions in their own way.
Yes.
What, according to you, should be the agenda of the global think tank, given the current economic crisis and due to pandemic?
There is a very clear contrast in the advice that is being given by different people. And you see this being played out right now today in America, in the presidential election. And the debate is really about, should we prioritize looking after people? Pandemic affects people. Should we prioritize looking after people? Or should we prioritize the economy? Now, of course, ultimately, there is no contradiction between them, because if there are no people left, obviously, there's no economy left. Let's imagine India's population is cut by 25% as a result of, let's imagine, a horrible thought, but let's imagine India's population is cut by 25% as a result of the pandemic. Let's imagine that. What will be the economic consequence of it? Complete confusion, complete disaster. Why? Because COVID doesn't distinguish between members of the cabinet, members of the bureaucracy, IAS, your normal man on the street selling something or buying something, right? So, of course, it will not be 25% of the cabinet and it won't be 25% of the street sellers. Of course not. But, in the cabinet, even one person, God forbid, dies. That's terrible. There'll be confusion, right? Because immediately it's a political game. Who is going to come next? What changes are going to come? Complete confusion. So ultimately, there is no contradiction between caring for the people and caring for the economy. But the question is, which do you prioritize? And you see this tension between the two, which do you prioritize, playing out in America, playing out in England, playing out in India. We see this playing out all over the place.
Correct.
So I think what we need to do is to bring all the experts together and run a normal kind of consultancy exercise, which is what we do in business. Because in business also, there are contradictory opinions.
Yes, absolutely.
One person wants to open a new market in China or in India or in Vietnam. Other person says, no, it's too expensive, politically risky, foreign exchange risk. We don't understand the culture, and all the arguments against, right? So what do we do in business? We bring all these people together. We listen to each other. We put out the arguments, and we ask people to respond to the arguments. You are against? Yes. Do you understand this argument for? Yes, I understand the argument for. What do you have to say about the argument for? And similarly, you go through a process of coming up with the best solution which looks after both the points that are being made, because both are important. And sadly, this is not being done, whether in India or in America or in England, anywhere. This is not being done. What is happening is both sides are becoming entrenched in their positions and firing at each other. That's all that's happening. And that is very counterproductive. You know, a wiser man than myself once said, a house divided against itself cannot stand.
Absolutely.
Right? And that is what is happening in America. It is a house divided against itself, happening in England, happening in India. We have houses divided against ourselves. And we cannot make progress. We cannot make progress as nations. We cannot make progress as a global civilization, because today there is no US economy without the Chinese economy or the Indian economy.
Yes.
There's no Indian economy without the American economy, European economy, Chinese economy. We are all interlinked, you know.
Absolutely. No, and globalization has interlinked us more strongly.
Right. So we need global solutions, not only national solutions. Of course, we need national solutions. I'm not arguing against them. We need national solutions and we need global solutions. And at the moment, we are not even having national solutions, forget global solutions. That is the problem with our society. So just to come back to the point which you raised, which is what I was trying to answer, what should we do in this context? One thing is we should bring both the economic prioritizers, financial prioritizers, and the human prioritizers together. But more important is to understand why it is that this pandemic rose in the first place.
Yes.
And there are, of course, environmental reasons why the pandemic rose. It may have been in Wuhan laboratory and so on, may not have been. I'm not going into that argument. But even if it was the Wuhan the laboratory where it started, for argument's sake,
yes,
why did it start there? Because of the entire economic, political, social system we have constructed, as a result of which this Wuhan laboratory exists. And because these viruses have started jumping from animals to humans, which they never did in history,
yes,
till now. So why have these viruses started jumping from animals to humans?
Animals to humans.
They have started jumping to human beings because their own natural habitat has been restricted and invaded by human beings.
Correct. Absolutely.
So we need to come up with a solution which not only prioritizes the economy and prioritizes people, but also looks after the environmental factors,
yes,
because of which this disease has risen. You know, if you look back 100 and whatever years in history, you can see the first great pandemic of this sort was the flu pandemic.
Yes.
Viral pandemic was the flu pandemic. And then for some years we had nothing. And then over the last few years, we've had the MERS pandemic, we've had the SARS pandemic, and so on. You can see that the number of pandemics that has come in the last few years has been really at a fantastic speed. So even after we overcome the COVID crisis, there will be some other virus hitting us soon, unless we address the root causes. And addressing the root causes involves us all as a global society to work together so that we can look after the environment properly, and we can come up with these sorts of solutions that are needed to look after both economics and people. And that is a massive task, which unfortunately nobody's even envisaging today. I mean, the powerful people, you and I can talk about it, but we're not important. The powerful people who should be thinking about it, who should be taking a lead on it, none of them is doing it. That is the sad thing. That is the tragedy of our civilization.
In fact, I was reading an article the other day on this, and a very senior author has rightly mentioned that this is the golden opportunity for the global thinkers and global governments and all countries to really reboot economy, environment, and education. All three are so basic, and we really need to bring it in line with thinking the world as one village, and human being as the center point of the impact of the economy.
You see, it is written in our scriptures. You know, the philosophy is written in our scriptures how many thousand years ago? But we don't implement it even in our own country. We don't implement it even in our own families. You know, these other people don't even have the philosophy. So how are they going to implement it?
I was about to bring you to India and
Yes.
ask you, should India have as we mentioned that India had the highest number of or second highest number of think tanks other than China. So
Yes.
what according to you, should we really India have its own think tanks? We have our own think tanks, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But
So sorry, just first a little correction. India has the second highest number of think tanks after America.
okay.
China comes number 3. Well, in 2018 came number 3. 2019 figures are not yet available. And it may be that China has overtaken us. It may be that we have pulled ahead of China. I don't know. But those are the last figures that were available.
So what should be our priorities?
First of all, I think we need to be conscious, and very often we are not conscious, that we have our own national think tank. It is called Niti Aayog. Used to be called the Planning Commission. But the Planning Commission actually goes back to the 1920s. Most people don't realize that. When Dr. Saha went to Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose and said to him, "Sir, we need a think tank for our country." And Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose created the first think tank. The trouble was that because Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose was not in the center of the mainstream of India, it was clear it was not going to have the kind of impact that it could have. So Nehruji spoke to Dr. Saha and said, "Please bring it into the Congress party." So Saha went back to Subhash Chandra Bose and said to him, "Sir, please, let's take it to Congress." And Subhash Chandra Bose was such a magnanimous, great-hearted man. He said, "Yes, let it be so." Saha then took it into the Congress. And the Congress created the first planning commission for the nation as a whole from our point of view. Trouble was, of course, we were not ruling the country. Then somebody had the bright idea, and I do not know honestly whose idea it was, but somebody had the bright idea that actually it is the British rulers of the country who should adopt this planning commission and make it the planning commission for the country. I don't know if it's a British idea, Gandhiji's idea, Nehru's, I don't know. But the British made it the planning commission for the whole country in 1944. 1944, we had for the first time a national think tank with the official approval and blessing and support and access and everything of the rulers.
Of Britishers.
And sorry?
The Britishers.
Of the Britishers at that time. This was, of course, just before independence, 44, 46, 47, just before independence.
Yeah.
With independence, Nehruji took this existing planning commission and made it into our first planning commission. Of course, there were some changes of personnel and all that, but basically it was that planning commission which became our first planning commission in India. And the planning commission did fantastic work in the first 5-year plan period. In my view, I'm giving my prejudiced view now, right? You may have a different view, others may have a different view, but from my point of view, in the first 5-year plan period, we did fantastic work. But in the second 5-year plan period, politically, we made a change, and we changed the priorities of the Planning Commission from rebuilding the rural sector and the infrastructure of the country to basically looting, I'm using loaded words, I should not use those words, basically exploiting the rural sector to create our own money reserves, which we could then put into prestige projects like Bhakra Dam. Bhakra Dam, remember, was the world's largest
dam.
Straight gravity dam in the world at that time, right? So it was a great prestige project for us, world's largest straight gravity dam in the world. Of course, I'm not saying it was a bad thing. All I'm saying is it was a prestige project. For this prestige project, we could have got money from outside, but no, Nehruji did not want to do that. He wanted our own money. And of course, instead of taking money from the rich, which would have been construed to be socialism, we decided to exploit and collect from our rural sector. So the rural sector began to be poorer and the elite urban sector began to be richer systematically and structurally from the second plan onwards. So the disease between the inequality disease between the very rich and the very poor in our country, the seed of it goes back to the second planning period. But I should say that that was the official side. The oldest existing independent think tank was created in 1930. It's a little later, in 1930, and that was the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, which is actually our oldest existing think tank. It has existed for 90 years, so it's quite old, quite ancient, quite well established in Pune. Now, it started with great energy, produced very good work. A book every year. It was a tiny think tank, and it produced one book every year. But slowly, the research productivity has declined. Now it is a deemed university. It's not only a think tank, now it's a deemed university. Of course, it's a small university, but it's a university. You know how many books they produce every year? You know how many books they produced in the last 35 years? They produced 6 books in 35 years. So you can see productivity has declined. So we need to understand why it is that productivity declines, whether in the case of the Planning Commission or in the case of Gokhale Institute. Why does productivity decline? Well, someone with entrepreneurial energy and the right connections and the right resources sees an opportunity and says we should start something. And he or she somehow succeeds in starting something. Other people say, oh, that's a good idea, I should join. And they come with the right missionary zeal to start something new, right? And they are very productive. But slowly over time, these guys get old. Slowly over time, these guys get tired. Slowly over time, these guys die. New people join. Why do they join? They don't join necessarily because they want to be highly productive. Some of them join because they're lazy and it's a nice job. You can sit and make money and they have a comfortable life. Other people join actually to exploit the institution, not only to have a comfortable life, but to exploit the institution for their own benefit. So slowly over time, these time servers, what I call time servers and rent takers, come in and occupy places. I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not saying this happened to Gokhale Institute.
But I'll tell you that happens across.
It happens across. It happens
across all institutions I have seen.
Yeah, no. But this is But this is the point I'm making. It does not happen across all institutions. And I'm giving you an example from think tanks. Our second oldest think tank is the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, TIS.
Correct. Yeah.
Tata Institute of Social Sciences has not declined in productivity. If you look at Tata Institute, it is flourishing. Yep. It is producing good work. So now, interesting question is, has anybody done any analysis of why Tata Institute of Social Sciences is still so productive? No. Nobody's done any analysis of it, including people who have been setting up think tanks since the 80s. We mentioned since the 80s, there's been an explosion in the number of think tanks in India and abroad. But in our country, we cannot afford to have millions of think tanks. Money is scarce in our country. We should be careful about how we spend money. Correct. So you would have thought somebody who was setting up a think tank would have said, let me analyze what is the history of think tanks in our country? What is the experience? Why is the first oldest think tank not so productive now? Second oldest is still very productive, maybe more productive than before. Why? What can I, setting up this new think tank, learn from it? No. Everybody starts, this is the problem with our mentality, you see. Our philosophy says egolessness is the highest ideal. But in fact, our culture is full of ahankar. Who started the first think tank? How is that important? No, not important. Gandhi, Nehru, not important. I am the great, I am the first think tank, So this kind of attitude really costs us in the long run. We should have the attitude, yeah, I want to be the greatest. Everybody wants to be the greatest. That's natural, right? Maybe not spiritually ideal, but it's natural. But in order to be the greatest, I must understand what is the experience, what is best practice, what should I do, what mistakes should I avoid? Correct. It's elementary stuff, but in our country, we don't do it. And that is why many think tanks are not as effective and not as productive as they could be.
Let me ask you the question of, and which is my favorite question, is by 2030, we will be the youngest populated country. What would be your, message? What would be your one thought to the young generation?
No, our biggest priority, our biggest need is job creation. Job creation cannot be done by government, and job creation cannot be done by companies. So you say, who's going to create jobs? In the modern world, jobs are only created as people with ideas create new companies. And as new companies then grow, that has two minimum criteria for success. That strategy has two minimum criteria for success. First of all, a population that is educated and trained to be entrepreneurial.
In the new education policy, the NEP 2020, which is being announced just 15 days back, that policy has a comprehensive chapter on how do we bring entrepreneurship education or skill sets in the education, in the mainstream of education system itself.
No, Nitin, these have been talked about for ages. So if you go back to Gandhiji, Gandhiji did not want the kind of education we have now. He wanted a very craft-based and entrepreneurship-based system, right? We never succeeded in implementing it. We have been through so many education policies. Our problem as a nation is we have no shortage of ideas, good quality ideas. Our problem is always implementation. Why is our problem implementation? We must understand this. Why is our problem implementation? Today, I have spent the entire morning, today, I've spent the entire morning trying to get a shipment out of a factory in Chennai so that it can reach Delhi. Why do I, sitting in London, need to chase a factory for the whole morning so that the shipment leaves the factory and gets into the lorries by which it can drive to Delhi? Why do I need to do that? Because the man running the factory is a man with great goodwill, nice man, honest man, and all the rest of it, fine. But the guy below him and the guys below him do not have the mental capacity and the skills to be able to execute simple things like what should be on this label that goes on this box so that when it gets to the destination, the warehouse knows what it is. How do you produce a challan, delivery challan, in such a way that the warehouse knows where to sign? So sitting here in London, I have to tell these guys, I have to actually make the graphic for the box. Otherwise, it won't get on the box to be delivered. So my time as a reasonably intelligent chap, this is not my skill set. I could have this skill set. It doesn't require any particular level of intelligence to do that. And actually, it doesn't require any particular level of intelligence to do my skill set either. It's simply hard work. But the fact is that I, instead of doing my dharma, if you like, have to do somebody else's dharma so that this chap can fulfill his dharma. And this is what happens in our whole system. You are a senior executive, you have to run, instead of doing your senior executive's job, you have to run about doing the job of the plumber, the carpenter, the driver. Otherwise, the job doesn't get done.
So your point was that we have to inculcate entrepreneurial education or entrepreneurial mindset.
With work ethic for the top as well as for the bottom. That is the basic level of education of our people has to go up. Till the basic level of education of our people goes up, we will never be able to create an entrepreneurial country. First thing. Second thing is, actually, even if we take the entrepreneurial ideas that are there right now, we can do with many more, but even if we take the entrepreneurial ideas that are there, we do not have the ecosystem by which we can nourish these ideas. We don't have it. Somehow, some of us have access to money abroad and we can go and get it. Great. But we do not have our own ecosystem. Yeah, there are one or two funds, I'm aware of them, but basically we don't have our own ecosystem for it. So in addition to creating the entrepreneurial and hardworking workforce, we also need to create the entrepreneurial ecosystem which can find ideas, finance ideas, take companies that are small to the next stage, take companies that are medium-sized to the next stage. This we do not have. This we do not have. That should be our national priority. If Modi ji only does these two things, forget everything else, he will have laid the foundations for the renaissance of India. And if he does not do these two things, whatever other great things he may do, the foundation will not be there for us to become a great nation.
Great, Mr. Guptara. Thank you very much for your valuable time, insights, and experience. It was a pleasure talking to you. I would also like to thank the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, Lifelong Learning and Extension of Mumbai University, the Indian Chamber of Commerce, LawSikho, and the Indian SME Accelerator Network. Let me conclude my vote of thanks with the humble prayer to the Almighty to bestow mankind with the right spirit to fight the coronavirus and help restore peace, prosperity, and bliss. Thank you.